I'm Jakob van Uexkull. I'm the founder of the World Future Council and also of the Right Livelihood Awards, which are often known as the Alternative Nobel Prizes. The World Future Council works as a voice for future generations because we find that today we are living at the expense of future generations. I think that is the biggest injustice in the world today. Our ancestors knew this. They even had institutions protecting, looking after the interests of future generations. They were called councils of seers into the future in pre-colonial India. The native North Americans had the principle of the seventh generation, looking at the impact on the seventh generation in the future of the decisions they took. And today we're impacting future generations more than our ancestors ever could, but we don't give them a voice. So this is, to me, by far the biggest issue. Of course, there are injustices today in the world, but the way we are behaving towards future generations, I think, is the biggest injustice for our organization. I think sort of misguided, cost-benefit analysis. We are in a situation where we knew that we can't continue like this over 40 years ago, the limits to growth. And I think there is a rich minority in the world who realized that this was so, and therefore global justice issues would again come to the front. Because if the cake isn't growing, if there can't be sort of eternal economic growth, then you have to face up to justice issues. And so they decided that they were going to create a global order which would protect their privileges. And that is our current neoliberal economic order, that is our current monetary system, that is the system we have been living under for over 40 years, where we have been expanding into the economic and ecological space of other countries, which means, of course, that when the crisis comes, it'll be simultaneous and global. We work with policymakers. We find that there are very many organizations talking about and seeing, why we need to change and what we need to change and where we need to go. But the how, of course, is the most difficult one. Many people agree in theory, for example, that subsidies on fossil fuels should be abolished. But when you actually look at how to do that in practice, it gets very hard and very challenging. So we identify policy solutions. Is there a country which has actually, or even a region, which has succeeded? And how can others learn from them? How can they copy? So we basically help to spread good policies, good laws and rules, and we work to break down silos because most organizations work just on one issue, your human rights or your development or environmental organization, but you have to be all of these today. Well, the greatest difficulty, frankly, is funding this kind of work because, as Martin Luther King once said, laws don't move the heart. They restrain the heartless, but they don't move the heart. And most funders want their hearts moved. And so, of course, working with policymakers to spread good laws is not something which is very attractive. You need somebody who really understands the importance of this. This is actually, it's the most important thing you can do, because otherwise you're just putting plaster on wounds. And of course, if somebody is bleeding heavily, that's what you need. But if you don't change the policy framework, then ultimately all this other work is going to be futile, because in a ruined planet, there can be no development or justice or anything. Well, I think we need much more cooperation. There is far too much silo thinking in civil society and among policymakers. And we all need to understand that we are citizens first, and we have to take responsibility. We have to become politically active. This doesn't mean we all have to become lifelong politicians, but it's very, very dangerous when people see politics as something dirty, and they think they can they even define themselves. The fact that civil society organizations define themselves with a negative as non-governmental, I always think is psychologically very, very bad. And in ancient Greece, of course, the politically engaged citizen engaged in public life was known as a politis, and the one who refused to get involved was known as an idiotus. And today people say, you have to be an idiot to get involved in politics, but that unfortunately means that we are disempowering ourselves. Well, I think a just future would build on what we already know in many areas, that there can be no human right to something which isn't possible. And clearly the resource consumption in Western Europe is not globally possible. I mean, there is no way that could, for example, even spread even in China. So we need to look back at, I think, the second report to the Club of Rome. The first one was on limits to growth. The second one is not so well known, but it was called No Limits to Learning. And I think there is much we can do. We cannot all become global consumers. The planet is too small for that, and people don't seem to be very, there's a sort of a limit, I think. The world can provide, as Gandhi said, enough for everybody's need, but not for everyone's greed. So I think that has to be the future. And of course, if you look back at what happened in Britain during the Second World War, there was, and in the USA also, it was a drastic reduction in frivolous consumption and frivolous production. People focused on what is important. And I think today we are seeing that what is important to preserve our civilization is basically to get back in tune with the planet and with nature. And one doesn't have to be sort of dramatic and say, it's the end of the world or the end of humanity. One just has to realize that we now live in one world, and in Africa, large parts are becoming uninhabitable because of global warming, because of climate change, climate chaos. And those Africans will try to come to Europe. And if we can't deal with the small numbers, comparatively tiny numbers, with the thousands, with the tens of thousands coming now, how are we going to deal with the tens of millions or hundreds of millions, which people expect, experts expect coming in the next decades? It's going to make our countries into failed states unless we really change our policies, unless we really create a crash program to make sure that people can stay in their own countries, reforestation, renewable energy. There are very many things we can do which drastically need to be upgraded and speeded up.